The revolution is real, it's live, and as some comrades say, it's lit, right? Lit.
Giving go my soul.
Real, live, lit. Right? The revolution is lit.
Uhuru Comrades, and welcome to today's Omali Sunday Study featuring Chairman Omali Yeshitela. My name is Yeshitela, Director of Agitation and Propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, as well as your MC for this morning. Today's study is highly important, and we encourage you right now to share the stream, invite your friends and family to it, so that as many of our people can be involved in this discussion. For this last Sunday of the year, we have a special episode titled Ask the Chairman, where Chairman Omali Yeshitela will answer the questions you have submitted. Ranging from various topics, our chairman will take this time to deepen our understanding on any and all of them. Throughout the year, you may have participated in the studies, and one of your questions may have not gotten asked because of time, but this special edition will give us the ability to deal with those questions now. We encourage our online viewers during this study to leave questions in the comment section so that Chairman can answer them live today. It is my honor to introduce the brilliant theoretician, the founder of African internationalism, which empowers us with the answers to these burning questions today, the leader of the worldwide African Revolution, Chairman Omali Yeshitela.
Uhuru. Thank you, Comrade Director Akile Anai, and want to welcome everyone who's come on to the study this morning. Today, as has been determined from the last study, and as a consequence of a suggestion, I think, made by a comrade who watches, participates in these studies from the Middle East. Is it Abu Dhabi? Where is it? Kuwait. We've decided to make this a rather freewheeling kind of discussion where we, as opposed to starting off or working from a particular text that, as we usually do, we open it up to dealing with some of the questions which have been raised by people during these discussions over the last period, and many of which do not get answered because of the duration of the study itself. And while we've done that, just looking at some of the studies that we have fielded, some of the questions, most of them revolve around the issue of the counterinsurgency that we've talked about over the last several weeks. I assume that there are others. These are questions that have been mined by people from the Department of Agitation and Propaganda and my staff, selected out. And I guess this because in part these were the freshest questions from the most recent studies that we've been involved in. But I suspect that there are other questions and issues that people may want to raise, and I'm opening this up too, if during this process you conclude that we are not dealing with some of the issues that you think important, as you should also raise them as questions. If we can get through the questions that have been provided up to this point, then we'll try to deal with other questions that you may raise or interventions that you may make. If we don't get through them in this process, we will continue a process where we will go back and then deal with outstanding issues and questions which may not have been spoken to during the normal and regular periods of the study. I want to express appreciation for everyone who has come on to the study. This study began several years ago as a part of the process to deal with the rapidly growing African People's Socialist Party, with so many people coming into our party who did not have history, experience, and needed political education. And this was done initially as a means by which we would provide political education, theoretical development for the Department of Agitation and Propaganda that has the primary responsibility for producing and distributing the ideas of the African People's Socialist Party to build the revolutionary movement. So we started off with this narrow goal in mind. And over the period of time, we now have a situation where thousands of people come to these studies, and the discussions have gone much greater than that, certainly to encompass the majority of people in the African People's Socialist Party and the Uhuru movement stretching across the globe. But there are other people who have not yet been won to active participation by coming into the party or coming into the organization itself. We want that to happen, but it's a much larger audience than we started off speaking to. And I'm mentioning this essentially because this is not just another session where we invite people to participate in information consumerism, where you come in and just engage in getting information for the purpose of being able to be active on social media to the extent that Facebook does not shut you down. It is about building a revolutionary movement. We have to win our freedom. One of the things that took us to this discussion of counterinsurgency is that our party was engaged in the most serious struggle for years, especially beginning in the 1980s, to expose this war that was being made on the revolutionary movement. Anybody who is participating in this study, who is conscious and aware of what's happening in the world or what has happened in the world, and does not recognize, does not understand that the United States government has a contingency plan to deal with Africans and other oppressed and colonized people within the United States, have missed the boat completely and have absolutely become subjected to the imperialist narrative and understanding of the world and all of the so-called democracy and wonders of America, even as African people are being gunned down in the streets of this country every day, and if African people are being starved, the indigenous people are still in concentration camps that they call reservations, and the people, Mexico, half of Mexico has never been returned, and the people who were from that territory before this artificial border was created to separate them from the rest of Mexico are still considered illegal aliens and other things like that. And the United States continues to be a settler colony. It's not like the people who control this country are indigenous to this land, as Africans are not indigenous to this land. Europeans left Europe and came to this land, just as later they would go to Palestine and steal that land, because what has emerged in the whole history of the struggle that we're involved in today is that a social system was born. Europeans living in a state of feudal poverty, repression, what have you, found themselves engaged in what has come to be known as the era of exploration, and what the rest of that, and set out from Europe and went out to the rest of the world, looting and stealing and actually enslaving peoples all around the world. This is how this whole social system came into being. And in the process of so doing, and especially after having established this social system that we now know as capitalism, also created a narrative to explain this phenomenon. And I'm not saying that somebody went into a room especially and say, hey, let's say this is what happened, that's what happened. I'm saying that we're looking at a superstructure, that is to say a system of ideas, a system of political thought and what have you that stems from the economic base of the society itself. And the economic base of the society that we live in is slavery and stolen land. It is the theft of what we now know as America that rescued Europe from feudalism. It is the enslavement of Africans and other people around the world that created a social system that rescued Europe from this feudal poverty, disease that Europe lived in, and stemming from that comes an explanation that nobody had to meet necessarily to talk about it, but philosophers and thinking representatives of the social system emerge, and then they say this is how it got to be this way. And they explain the existence and the conditions of existence of other peoples, Africans, indigenous people here, the Mexican people, people in what are recognized as Arab countries, and the rest of it. They explain our poverty, our conditions of existence as due to some ineptitude, moral and productive ineptitude on our side. There's something wrong with us. And they explain their wealth and resources, which has come through robbing us of everything that we need to live, and our right to self-determination. They explain that is coming from their own genius, their own civilized achievements, etc. So that's the world we live in, and everybody has been dominated by this explanation of reality, because from this, a whole social system was born, a social system born from the way in which society has come to achieve what it needs to survive. And that's part of what it is that we are contending with, and it's the part of the brutal struggle that oppressed peoples around the world involved in, and many of us are unaware that we engage in a struggle against a particular social system, because most of the oppressed do not leave our communities most of the time. We live in our villages, we live in small communities. Our worldview has been extraordinarily restricted by the walls of repression that have been established by the social system that dominates us. So that's what we're dealing with. And we have to break out of that. And what it means is that when we take on these discussions and struggles, when we look at the political expressions, ideological expressions coming from the African People's Socialist Party, which these are expressions born of an historical materialist investigation and interpretation of the world, then it goes against the grain of what everybody is being taught all the time. So sometimes even in the communities of the oppressed, that we engage in this struggle to reveal what reality is, as opposed to the reality that's been imposed on us, the false reality that we've come to understand as the truth. Like the Santa Claus is not real. I'm telling you this, that Santa Claus is not real, and that it's a tool that's used to keep the people oppressed. And the fact is that Tonto is not real, was not real. These versions of people that were created to maintain our relationship and the way we understand ourselves, the blue, black Sambo, and all this other stuff that we've come to know imposed on us by a whole social system. We must understand this social system if we're going to get out of this. Because otherwise what we do is we find ourselves struggling to improve our lot, but we've accepted the basic definition of how we got to be here, the reality that and morality that comes from the ones who control the system as the truth. And so we find ourselves fighting to be free, and actually in most instances we're fighting to find a space, a tolerable space within a system of oppression and exploitation. And we don't get free in that fashion. So we've been now dealing with this question of counterinsurgency. African people, just like the white people here, are not indigenous to this land. We were brought here in captivity. I'm not debating the silliness that some people want to say, well, we was here first before Columbus, and we were here before the so-called Indians, and we were indigenous. That ain't even the question. The reason it's not the question is because when we talk about whose land this is, we're talking about who were the custodians of this land, where white power came here and took it. And they didn't take it from Africans, they took it from the indigenous people, and it's part of the process of establishing the social system. And the majority of us who are here now experience the consequences of having been captured by these same Europeans who stole this land and then brought us here. So this is no debate about who was here first. This is a debate about how the system got born through the Africans and white people and indigenous people meeting each other on this land, on this territory, and the consequences of that. That's what it's about. That's what we want to talk about. And because there's no way that you can overthrow a reservation somewhere in Oklahoma and win your freedom. It is not the so-called Indians who took your freedom, took our freedom. And that's the thing, the essence of the question is what we want to get to. Because if you don't, you find yourself fighting your friends and allowing the ones who are responsible for our condition to get off the hook. So here are Africans who are fighting because we were here first, and a social system that came here got here as a consequence of taking the land and resources from the indigenous people, who are often referenced as Indians, and bringing people who we know to be Africans to this land and giving us all new identities that serve the purpose of a social system that robbed everybody and brought wealth and resources. I mean, the white man has become an American. He left Europe maybe as a Swede, maybe as an English person, maybe as a German, and somehow disappeared once here. And so the looters are not even recognized as the thieves and looters because they are now Americans. And they have named the territory that they've stolen America, and they give the impression that they've always been here when you're looking at the settler colonies, a territory that was settled by colonizers, people who are not indigenous to this land, and they have robbed and killed and murdered the people who are indigenous to this land, and they brought another people not indigenous to this land here for the purpose of creating tremendous amount of wealth, not only here, but throughout the European world, throughout the world. The whole social system was born of that. That's the thing that we really have to continue to explore, understand if we're going to achieve some kind of liberation. So I wanted to just say that. I know that there'll be other questions, and this is a part of how we have come to understand the world as African internationalists. We're not just some black people. We're not in here because black people don't have no rights and white people. We don't struggle with this whole concept of white privilege, and we're suffering from white privilege. I mean, no more than people who were fighting against slavery were fighting against white privilege. We were fighting against a system of enslaving us, colonial slavery. That's what we're fighting today. When you fight against so-called white supremacy, you're fighting for a place within a social system that has no redeeming qualities at all. The system itself came into existence through colonial slavery, stealing this land, stealing this territory. You got to fight to overturn our relationship to an entire system, as opposed to find there's some way to get some privileges equal to the white people, or to somehow remove white people from this quote-unquote white privilege by that's something that would keep you like a dog chasing its tail. You'll never get out of this in that fashion. So I'm just saying some things about who we are. We are materialists. We are historical materialists. We understand that the social system has an origin. It came into existence and that we are contending with a social system. It's not just some bad white people over here and some good black people over here, because we know some rotten black people who are still colonized, as rotten as they are, and do not necessarily have our best interests at heart. We live as a colonized people, and if it's based on some subjective interpretation of the behavior of individuals, whether they're good or whether they're bad, etc., we will never be free. Our enemies come as preachers. They come as imams. They come in all kinds of trappings. So you got to know the system. And whether or not the preacher or the imam or whomever it is that we are dealing with, regardless of the morality that they preach from their pulpits or their mosque or whatever else, regardless of that, then the morality that we have to understand is whether or not what they preach contributes to destroying this relationship we have to a social system and the social system itself, or does it contribute to advancing the interests of Africans and other people, and certainly the international working class, to win our freedom and access to our resources? That's the question we're confronted. That's where I find morality, and that's where, as a materialist. So anyway, after that long introductory, I want to go ahead and look at some of the questions that have been provided for us. And there is a question from Imani Mahdi from Boston. And she says, I have a question about the Department of Agitation and Propaganda video entitled How the Party Survived the Counterinsurgency, Part 3. And the question is, were any of the following PGRNA, that is the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa government officials in this picture, part of the counterinsurgency? And a picture came with this question. And I'm not saying that anybody who was there, I don't know if anybody who's in that picture was an agent of the United States government. Let's say a conscious agent of the United States government, paid by elements of the United States government, as were some people who we know actually were. I'm not saying that's the case. Our struggle began, we believe that there was a particular time where one could find a really progressive element in the Provisional Government Republic of New Africa. It was really important that when, upon their founding, they saw themselves as Malcolmites, that is to say, followers of Malcolm X, who were trying to implement the philosophy, the developing philosophy of Malcolm X that talked about self-determination, self-government, and what have you. And they saw themselves as a force that was bringing that into existence. They unfortunately adopted this philosophy, this line, this political line that came from the Communist Party USA around 1928, when it, as a consequence of a struggle that it was involved in with Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Associations, where the Communist Party USA struggled mightily to win Africans to seeing ourselves as some kind of chocolate-colored white workers, that we didn't have an interest as a people, but somehow we were part of this international working class, and fought against Garvey, along with people like Du Bois and others who were firmly attached to the notion that somehow we would have some multinational, some integration of the peoples in this country, regardless of what it took to do that. And so we would abandon our interests for national liberation and somehow to unite with the idea that people living in the United States were a working class. And so that is our primary identity, was as a working class, recognizing that black people here in the United States, and articulating this in other places around the world, examples where people who became quite prominent in the Communist Party USA, who were part of their international arm, like George Patmore and what have you, who articulated this fact that we were everywhere. Black people, talk about our conditions in Africa and the Caribbean and here in a way that obviously recognized the fact that we were one people on the one hand, catching the same hell, identified contradictions in Caribbean and Africa and in the United States as more or less the same. But somehow something had happened with Africans in the United States, particularly in what they characterized as the Black Belt South, that had changed us, that we had become a Black Belt South became the national homeland. And they had to come up with a way for African people to be a national entity, because Marcus Garvey had this incredible influence, and there were millions of African people attached to the Garvey movement. Yet they were attacking the Garvey movement, trying to destroy it and trying to win Africans to the and they were unsuccessful in doing that. And not only were they unsuccessful in doing that directly and in their own name, they also participated in funding and supporting an entity that was called the African Blood Brotherhood, run by an African whose name was Cyril Briggs, and through whom they also pushed the Black Belt Southland, although that's not exactly and directly where it came from. There's a lot of history to that, and you should investigate it, look into it. But the point is that now that they cannot win Africans in the Garvey movement, while Garvey was alive, they could not win Africans to the Communist Party USA. They could. And the Garvey movement, which was characterized itself as African fundamentalism, the Garvey movement had to contend with the Du Bois NAACP, because Du Bois, whatever anybody else wants to say about him, was a member of NAACP when he founded the first formal expression of political Pan-Africanism with the Pan-Africanist Congress in 1919. It happened in Paris, France, with the collaboration of the French government and with a traitor whose name was Blaise Diagne, who was actually was somebody, one of his ancestors, not his ancestors, but one of his, what do you call people who are born of that thing? Is that progeny? Whatever the hell he was, but a descendant, one of his descendants actually came into the African People's Socialist Party and did the same thing that Blaise Diagne did with Garvey. And he allowed, the French allowed the Du Bois movement to come into and hold its first Pan-Africanist Congress there in France in 1919, with the condition that they could not condemn French colonialism. And it was attended mostly by officials from France, from the French government, and other imperialist countries who sat there watching this whole thing unfold. It was born in contention with the Garvey movement, and it was African petty bourgeoisie and Du Bois, who was a representative of the NAACP, who was their editor of the Crisis magazine, that presided over this meeting. Du Bois, with the philosophy of the talented 10, Du Bois, who was how do we characterize people who are so full of themselves that that's the only thing they can see? Come on, you know what I'm talking about. How do you call narcissist? He was an extreme narcissist, brilliant man, but he was a narcissist, and who was also wounded emotionally and otherwise by the fact that the U.S. imperialists never accepted him as one of them. He went to schools in Berlin, Germany. He went to Harvard University. He was a very brilliant and accomplished scholar, and still was rejected because of his blackness. He was the one who came up with something of the 20th century as the color thing, the problem of the 20th century. And so he was one of those forces that helped to attack the Garvey movement and the whole struggle for African independence. And the Communist Party USA, he attacked the Garvey movement, and there were other forces at that time who were associated, coming from different positions. So you had the NAACP type integrationists, more or less, who helped to deal with who helped to create the Pan-Africanist Congress. And what you must understand is we're talking about in the early 1900s when this was happening. And you must understand is that many Africans had no, especially intellectuals, had no assumption, just like today, by the way, Africans will ever be able to run our own affairs, and were looking to find a way to make the system work for black people, African people, and under the leadership of them as the talented 10th, the 10% that's got education by the bourgeoisie who would preside over the rest of us. So Du Bois promoted a kind of neo-colonialism. So you had Du Bois and the Pan-Africanist Congress. You had the Communist Party provided explanation of African people have been transformed into a new nation, more or less, in the Black Belt South. That was our national homeland now, since we had left the continent of Africa et cetera. And so later on, because even that didn't work, they still did not win masses of African people to the Communist Party USA. And they destroyed the Garvey movement. They slandered the Garvey movement extensively, not just the bogus charges of somehow Garvey was cheating the black workers out of their money who bought steamship lines and set up factories and did all this other stuff, because we hear that too from the African People's Socialist Party. But you can see the evidence of what Garvey did in the fact that we had steamship lines, we had factories, we had the black doll, the black Jesus. All of this stuff came as a consequence of the Garvey movement. So you saw where those resources went. So Garvey he did with that slander, but they even claimed, Cyril Briggs' newspaper at one time claimed that Garvey had raped a 12 or 13-year-old white girl. And, just the most ridiculous kinds of assaults on Marcus Garvey, part of counterinsurgency happened. And so we had this process where you had the Black Belt South position, you had the Pan-Africanist integrationist position, and then you had Garvey. So these were political tendencies that coexisted at the same time. So it's not like, is there a question of whether Africans would support African internationalism or the unity of all African people versus a Black Belt South position versus a Pan-Africanist position. We had a real laboratory where that happened in the real world, and the masses went with Garvey and recognize that we are one Africa, one nation of people, and that our future is one, together. And then what has happened, of course, subsequent to that, when the Republic of New Africa became these Malcolmites, they wanted to implement the Malcolm's philosophy more or less, and they adopted a version of the Black Belt South with the thing that African people now in the United States are new Africans, which is to say more or less that we have become a nation inside the United States in what they call 5 states inside the United States. And what our position has always been is that this is an opportunist position, even though we saw it as progressive, because at the time what it did was promote self-determination. And we were in a contest at this time in the history when it came into existence. Our basic contest was not something among folk who were fighting for self-determination. It was those who wanted self-determination and those who were promoting integration. That was the big struggle. So we said this is progressive. When you say self-determination, that's progressive. But the Black Revolution of the 60s was, and I'm going to say more than that. I want to say that the Republic of New Africa took courageous stances. They actually engaged in armed struggle in Mississippi. They engaged in armed struggle in Detroit, Michigan, where the FBI and others invaded a church where they were having a meeting, a church that was the church of Aretha Franklin's father. And when they invaded, they ran into a hail of gunfire, got shot up and everything. And at the moment, one of the reasons Detroit has been destroyed is because it was just one of the highest level of political consciousness and organization of African people. Because they took these comrades to jail, and almost by the time they got to jail, there was a black judge who was there and released them all on their own recognizance. So these comrades have fought fierce battle. They have been imprisoned. They have gone through all of this stuff. There is no question in our mind about the heroic struggle of the Republic of New Africa, but they had a philosophy that was opportunistic. It doesn't matter how genuine the belief system of some of them were, but it was an opportunistic philosophy that resulted in opportunistic practices. And when we say it was opportunistic, how the hell can you claim 5 states, 1 state, or even a barbecue stand in Florida as the new nation when the indigenous people have damn near wiped out under aggression, living in concentration camps, and the primary factor of their oppression and exploitation is the theft of their land. So no matter what it is you're saying, you engage in uniting with the people the force and system that's stolen their land in an effort to so-called win your freedom. And an opportunistic philosophy results and can only result in opportunistic practices. So we, came out with a book that was called Black Power since the 60s, poor title, poorly copy edited, and the rest of it, but it was a really important book because it's part of the process struggle we were waging against opportunism. And what is opportunism? Opportunism is to sell out the long-term and to betray the long-term interests of the African revolution of the African working class for the benefit of the short-term interests of a sector of the petty bourgeoisie or something like that. So what is the longer-term interest of the African working class, of the African nation itself? Is the total recapture of the 12 million square miles of Africa, all the resources, everything that's come from it, and the resources from all the African peoples of the world that's been displaced and used to build and fit and build this whole capitalist system. That's what we have to concentrate on. So that's what the party has been about. And so we say it's an error. It was an opportunistic philosophy. And it resulted in opportunistic policy. And we saw this in the 1989, I think we started a series of articles that came to be this Black Power since the 60s book that we published. And because we were struggling against all this evidence of counterinsurgency that was attacking the African population. And let me just read from the introduction briefly of Black Power since the 60s. And this was published in 1991. So we say from May 1989 through February 1990, 5 articles appeared in the Burning Spear, the political organ of the African People's Socialist Party. These articles raised the question of opportunism within the movement to defeat domestic colonialism in the U.S. from in the U.S. front of the African liberation movement. In the process of making this struggle against opportunism, 2 tendencies within the U.S. front of our movement were criticized. 1, New Africanism, most seriously, as representing opportunistic politics born of opportunistic theory. The Burning Spear articles, which included a transcribed presentation, which criticizes opportunistic tendencies within our own Uhuru movement, were demanded by various escalating contradictions our freedom struggle is confronted with and our movement's level of preparedness to deal with them. We're trying to solve a problem here. This is why we engage in discussion. We ain't talk about nobody's mama. We didn't say who was sleeping with white people. We didn't go to any of that kind of nonsense. There are political questions that had to be raised, and that's by the way, is when you can identify the difference in slander and genuine political struggle, because we engaged in political struggle up and down the line. People hated to see us coming because you couldn't attack the revolution without having some kind of response from the African People's Socialist Party. And you can tell the integrity of a movement by that. By whether or not it's just engaging in some kind of slander, or whether it raises up the political and ideological questions and attack them in public view. Everybody can see this, and people can then make a judgment on the correctness or incorrectness of what it is you said, and you're in a situation now of having to defend and develop your own political line because it's engaged in that kind of a struggle. That's a struggle with integrity. We've had counterinsurgency that functions as slander. Slander functions, it serves counterinsurgency. We've seen the U.S. government create contradictions between organizations that's resulted in people killing each other. And because political questions and struggles were not raised, ideological questions and struggles were not raised. Instead, we had garbage that's thrown into the mix, and so that contaminates the struggle itself, because you can't solve a problem with dishonest forces. You have to have honesty of, this is my position. I have enough confidence in my political position, my ideological stance, to put that forward in contention with any other political and ideological. If you can't do that, then you resort to slander. If your philosophy and your political line can't stand examination, then you resort to slander. And there are people who today, talk about, I'm married to a white woman. And this has been something that's been, put forth since the 1960s. And on the front line of the discussion in the African community are integrationists. Now here the integrationists claiming I'm married to a white woman, which they should think is a wonderful thing because they themselves are integrationists, but they don't. They know that this contaminates who I'm supposed to be, and so that's why they put it forward. And that's the garbage, the substitutes for a genuine political and ideological struggle, right? And by the way, this was not a statement of the value of persons in terms of whether or not they're married to white people or not. That's not the basic point that I'm making. I have a position on that. It's not a subjective position, however. It's based on the objectives of what our revolution has to be about, which is the actual liberation of our people. And sometimes we have been tricked into seeking personal solutions. And that's what the whole integrationist thing does for us. It gives us an opportunity to seek a personal solution to a profoundly deep political contradiction that we suffer from as a people. So you can't win your freedom, but you have the right to marry a white woman. Or you have the right to marry somebody of the same sex. All of these are substitutes. These are diversions that's thrown at us by our oppressors. So without even getting into the validity of whether somebody should marry the same sex or whether somebody, African should marry somebody else, the question is that the way this stuff is happening to us, they offer these as solutions. That's opportunism. They offer you an opportunity to be in opportunism. The greatest thing you can have is a white woman, right? Everybody knows that. So, we say that these contradictions included the ever-escalating attacks on the national democratic rights of African people by the U.S. North American capitalist, colonialist state and people, attacks which continue up to now. Added to these attacks is the case of a North American man in Milwaukee who captured, killed, and in some cases ate his African victims, and the nomination of Clarence Thomas, a neo-colonialist of the most servile kind, to the U.S. Supreme Court to validate the open aggression by the Supreme Court against our democratic rights. This is the kind of stuff that was going on that helped to give context to the struggle that we were waging against opportunism. And we talk about opportunism because if you can be on the way to revolution, to a revolutionary transformation, overturning a whole social system, and the U.S. imperialist state or government can toss you something out to give you some kind of immediate satisfaction short of that objective, that's opportunism. Because the struggle is for our own people. The struggle can't be for any individual or 6 individuals or 200 individuals to get a solution that does not serve the interests of the masses of the African people. That's what we're talking about. And you cannot. I don't care. The thing about that made the 5-state thing so attractive is because it appeared to offer a more or less immediate solution. Because you had all these black people living in the South, you can claim this territory, you live in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. So it appeared to offer that. This is an easy way forward, it appears to be. You just move to Mississippi. You can almost do that by virtue of demographics, get everybody to move to Mississippi, just like white people had everybody to move to New Zealand, but they were killing the indigenous people there as a part of the process, just like move to Palestine. Kick the people out, put them in prison, etc. You got all these Palestinians, never seen Palestine, living in refugee camps all around the world, and everybody cooperates with this illegitimate white nationalist settler state, which is an instrument of imperialism to destroy and undermine the struggle of the Palestinian people, which is a part of the struggle for the national liberation of the Arab people, who, and at one juncture in the history of this struggle, was the real conscience of the revolutionary movement of the Arab population, Palestine. And that, there's a lot to be said. Beyond that, of course, that includes the Palestinian stores in our community where, there's a lot. And that helps to deal with the whole question of opportunism. What is the long-term interest? So a Palestinian who cannot live in Palestine because the Europeans who call themselves Israelis have kicked them out, oppress them in Palestine, will not allow them to own in Palestine, so they can come to the United States and they can set up shop in the African community, where the United States government will not allow Africans to set up shop. And they treat the Africans in the United States in the same way that the Israelis treat the Palestinians in occupied Palestine. And if you're not clear on what it is you're looking at, you can be wrapped up in a whole ball of confusion. So ideological clarity is critical. And the struggle against opportunism is critical. And the Palestinians who do what they do in our community are opportunists. And they treat Africans in our community the same way Palestinians get treated in occupied Palestine. That's called Israel. That's the basis of our struggle, not because there's some Arabs, although that's the common expression, the experience that African people have without political education is that they can go into one of these stores that's owned by people who do not believe in eating pork, who demand respect for their women, and who will set up shop and have the crummiest kinds of foods and pork and everything that they don't believe in eating themselves, and treat African women with horrible disrespect. So anyway, so these and other attacks on our people and movement represent an ongoing vicious counterinsurgency. While ever present since our forced sojourn within this U.S. North American hell, this counterinsurgency has achieved a different character since its effective use during the Black Revolution of the 60s to destroy our movement for happiness and repossession of our stolen resources. Essentially, this counterinsurgency changed character from one which, while it attacked the whole African people, had its primary emphasis on the destruction of specific individuals and organizations, to one which has as its primary target the entire African people, especially the revolutionary African working class. So at the height of revolutionary struggle, the counterinsurgency, while generally speaking, if you're a colonized and oppressed people, the counterinsurgency works all the time to keep you locked down. But then at the moment, against the whole people, at the moment, then there emerges a vanguard, an advanced detachment to lead the people out of this situation. Then the counterinsurgency, while still oppressing everybody else, concentrates on that advanced detachment, that group that's leading the people out. That's how Malcolm got killed. That's how King got killed. That's how Panthers got wiped out in this country. That's the basis of the attack on Jomo and the African People's Socialist Party, because at this time, the U.S. government, to maintain the colonial domination of African people, had to assault that element of the African population that was leading the whole people to freedom. So now you can't concentrate just on the whole people alone. You set up the target primarily as those forces leading it, and that's what we see happening with the U.S. government. What was Jim Crow except counterinsurgency? For whatever else it was, the absolute total domination, population, resource control of the African population. At the moment the struggle gets out of hand because it has some kind of leadership, you got to kill Nat Turner, you got to destroy those forces, you got to shoot Medgar Evers, you got to do something to all those forces who are rising up trying to lead this thing out of here. And then at some juncture in this process, as has happened in the African community, we concluded that we have to have our own government. That it happened before Marcus Garvey tried to lead us out of that. Marcus Garvey, who influenced Malcolm X's daddy, who influenced Malcolm X, etc., and who influenced Elijah Muhammad. And so you now start looking toward your own government. But having your own government is not enough. Because if it were, we wouldn't have a damn thing to worry about any place on the continent of Africa. We wouldn't have to worry about anything in Haiti, anything in Jamaica and Trinidad and all these other places. Having your own government is not enough. Having a government is not enough. It's a social system. And those who participate and get connected to, intertwined with that social system, they end up being managers of the rest of us. That's what Du Bois volunteered to do. And so when you volunteer to take 5 states of the United States, you're not just assaulting the indigenous people, you are separating these people who live in these 5 states from the overall struggle of Africa and African people, and Africa suffers as a consequence of that assault on Africa that removed huge sectors of the population, even making Africa underpopulated today, and then employ us as forces who produce wealth and resources for the social system itself. So you got a government now in Mississippi. No. It has to be a part of a process to overturn the social system itself. That's what we're involved in. And you can't overturn the social system without uniting with the indigenous people, not as an afterthought, not because the African People's Socialist Party say, look at what you're doing, and therefore you have to come up with something else, not because we say that's a form of Zionism when you're talking about taking this land, not because you have to respond to us like that and you have to come up with solutions that somehow try to liquidate that reality. You do that because of the kind of movement that you have, because of the essential contradiction that we know we are faced with as the whole social system came into existence through the enslavement and colonization of Africans that was central to the development of the system, but other peoples around the world, that results in a reality today where 80% of the people on the earth only try to survive off $10 or less a day. That's the reality we're confronted with, not just black people in Jackson, Mississippi, not just black people somewhere in Alabama, etc. The fact is this whole world system is constructed off of slavery and colonialism, and we got to tear it down in order for us to be free, and central to that is the liberation of Africa and African people, and that's what we have an opportunity and obligation to take on. That's why we talk about the opportunism of the New Africanist stance. And we do more than that. We show how, I'm going to see if I can just find a quick quote from this. We say that because this is the book, you don't have it. It's out of print. But you can probably email or communicate with our Office of Department of Agitation and Propaganda and purchase, a scanned or copy or something of the book. I think that's probably possible. But on page 40 here, it says, because the Black Revolution of the 60s did acquire organizational representation by political formations who attempted to provide political and ideological leadership for our people's struggles, the focus of the U.S. counterinsurgency, which employed tanks. Wow. I've been going on for a while now. Which employed tanks, National Guardsmen, and U.S. regular troops, in addition to the various domestic police agencies against the whole people. Its concentration was centered on our organizations and its leaders. However, an attempt to prevent the recurrence of a revolutionary period within the U.S., the colonialists have focused a broad-based counterinsurgency on the entire domestic African working class as a revolutionary social force whose genuine aspirations can only be realized through revolution. Thus, we have the neo-colonial component of the counterinsurgency, which mobilizes a traitor sector of the domestic African petty bourgeois against the African working class in the interest of colonialism, and as another component of the imposition of an illegal white capitalist drug economy on our working class communities. This drug economy causes a tremendous violent destabilization of our community and provides the colonial state the necessary political cover for a massive ongoing public military mobilization against the impoverished African working class. Thus, both the drugs in our community as well as the colonialist war against drugs are a part of the U.S. counterinsurgency designed to keep our revolution down. The RNA clearly participates in this counterinsurgency on the side of the white ruling class colonial state. Oberdelli, and I'm talking about an article written by then president of the Provisional Government of the Republic of New Africa, Imari Oberdelli. Oberdelli's article in the spring 1989 issue of the New African makes this excruciatingly clear. The article begins, quote, on a chilly evening last month, the newspaper is undated, so it's unclear what month is referred to here. Members of Block 12 in the Lamont Riggs Citizenship Association in Northwest Washington, D.C., under the leadership of Sister Margie Wood and her husband and the husband-wife team of attorney Nkechi Taifa and brother Kofi Owusu, two officials of the RNA Provisional Government, staged a flashlight-waving, exuberant rally and march to, quote-unquote, reclaim our streets and our playground from the scourge of drugs. For 90 minutes that evening, the youthful drug dealers yielded their accustomed marketplace in the shadows of the playing field. Mrs. Word's march, supported by many neighbors and city council persons, Charles Drew Jarvis, who lives in the neighborhood, and John Ray, as well as the young stern-faced police precinct captain, mirrored efforts of black people, new African people throughout the land to take direct action to fight back against drugs, to prevent teen pregnancies, and otherwise stop our people's disastrous disintegration. Our people's determination is the good news. There is a national effect, that is, an effort of the black or new African nation across this land, a passionate determination to resist destruction and build a good future. There is a national movement among us and the beginning of a national strategy. Unquote. So according to the president of the Provisional Government of African people colonized by the worst imperialism ever known to humanity, this neo-colonial march, supported by armed representatives of U.S. white power and a young, stern-faced police precinct captain as part of a national movement and the beginning of a national strategy to stop our people's disastrous disintegration. This is what they're saying. Obadele has accepted the general line of the white ruling class put forward by the black petty bourgeoisie, which defines the current conditions of existence of our people as due to some behavioral problem on our part. This line defines the vast majority of the African people here as a quote-unquote permanent underclass, whose wretched condition is self-inflicted, caused by hostility to the work ethic, teenage pregnancies, and other equally nonsensical ruling class fabrications. If the above quoted passage of this article does not make this clear, then certainly his collaborationist opportunist so-called national strategy as revealed in the following passage of this article would clear up any doubt. Quote, our national strategy lacks perhaps two essential ingredients. First, the resources needed to increase success of all the local efforts and link them across the land. Second, true men with guns who serve the people. Mrs. Word, however, speaking her warming words to the chill night and gathered neighbors, told of the ingredients of our national strategy, which we already have in place. The offer of love, coupled with the warning that the unreconstructed, lawless ones must be made to face the sure retribution and removal which is possible through the structure of the state as it exists today. So there it is, plain and simple. Obadele's national strategy requires 1, resources, 2, true men with guns, and 3, an offer of love coupled with a sure retribution and removal of the unreconstructed lawless one through the structure of the state as it exists today. Put plain and simple, Obadele's so-called national strategy is the same as George Herbert Walker Bush, the U.S. CIA president, and William Bennett, the so-called drug czar. Concretely, Obadele calls for money, armed men, and police and imprisonment of our people by the U.S. colonial government, which is the structure of the state as it exists today. That's the structure of the state as it exists today. To make sure you understand what his intent is, Obadele gives an example of why armed men, he refers to them simply as an army of true brothers, are needed, not to fight the occupying colonial army known as the police, in whom his article shows maximum confidence, but to fight against our own oppressed people, particularly the young Africans. And so we say, quote, leaders of the youthful playground drug dealers, had left their accustomed turf during the march, but they had not retreated far. One, about 25 years old, stood in the mouth of an alleyway as the marchers went by. When the brothers from the Nation of Islam approached and talked with him and others, this young dealer opened his coat and coolly displayed a large gun in his waistband. The policeman nearby looked on. he said and did nothing at this bold display of an illegal weapon, perhaps to avoid crossfire and danger to the many people on the streets. And since when has an element of the colonial occupying army ever hesitated to shoot for fear of hitting some African in the crossfire? Clearly, however, the needed element of our black national strategy is the army of true brothers with adequate firepower, power, and clear mission. That mission being to serve the people who will meet with retribution those unconstructed merchants of death who with their arms would intimidate Mrs. Word and all of us. So here we have the RNA, Nation of Islam, Negro colonialist politicians, and stern-faced police precinct on one side, and the unrestricted lawless ones on the other. We ask our readers to determine for yourselves whether it is possible to be on the side of the armed representative of the white ruling class colonial state and still be on the side of our people who are crushed down to the bone by colonialism. Can there be any doubt that Obadele and the RNA are participating hand in glove with the current counterinsurgency being waged against our people? So there's a lot more to be said here, but this is the basic point. So we're not saying that anybody was a snitch, but there's a class element to the struggle for liberation that does not get recognized too easily and too often by our struggle, whether it's on the continent of Africa and elsewhere. That's why we're able to see the election of Nelson Mandela, who was a traitor to Africa, a traitor to the working class, some kind of progress. Nelson Mandela, who upon being released from the authority of the apartheid regime and holding a rally in his first statement, told the masses to throw your weapons into the sea. Nelson Mandela, whose ANC, African National Congress, has gone into power, who had his first split in the 1950s as a consequence of some kind of freedom charter that was actually written by the leader of the South African Communist Party, Joe Slovo, who claimed that freedom charter that claims that South Africa belonged to all who lived there, the oppressed and the oppressed, the people who stole the land and the people from whose the land was stolen. So today you live at this philosophy being represented in the fact that the all who live there has left control of the land, the resources in the possession of the white people who were the colonizers, and the Africans who were colonized still have nothing today and are worse off in some ways than they were before. And we have the looting expedition that was begun by the apartheid regime now being carried out by this neo-colonial settler power in the form of the African National Congress. You have in the United States people all around the world, Africans cheered, wow, we're free because the black person is in head of state in the United States, where the white power selected Barack Hussein Obama as its representative. I said its representative because they gave him $1 billion or more. One of the most expensive campaigns ever run by a presidential candidate in the United States that had more funds from Wall Street than any other up to then in history. And so he was their candidate for the U.S. because they needed this counterinsurgency, which is worldwide counterinsurgency, international counterinsurgency, where they gave imperialism, colonialism, the look of those who are being colonized. What a tremendous game that's being played on the rest of the people. But if you don't know what it is you're fighting for, you see the election selection of Obama as representing progress because there's a black person that's there. That's how we got into this whole discussion about the Republic of New Africa. We're not talking about any specific individuals and whether or not they were snitches or they were conscious agents, but the class element comes to play, and it contributes to the whole issue of opportunism and settling for something short of the total liberation of our people, and the RNA did that. It has an opportunist philosophy, and it manifests itself also in opportunist politics as it expressed throughout the United States. And I say this recognizing that the RNA at a time in history was a progressive force as somebody that was really struggling and holding up the question of self-determination. But that was when the fundamental question was one of self-determination versus capitulation, integrationist, assimilationist. That was where the contest was. Now, the contest is not there. The fact is that even as this was happening, the counterinsurgency killed revolutionaries, so that this struggle that needed to play itself out, this ideological struggle within the revolution itself, couldn't get played out because the government killed the main players, locked up people in prison. So these were unresolved issues and questions that the African People's Socialist Party was trying to take on, and we still take them on. We have come to certain kinds of conclusions because we did not die. We continue to struggle even since that period up until now, and we are resolving many of the contradictions that were left unresolved. Many of the ideological questions that were left unresolved are being resolved by the African People's Socialist Party. So that's how we came to that. I hope that was helpful. And if not, I'm sure that you will send other questions to us that we can take on later. And I spent a lot of time dealing with that, but I think it was important to lay a certain kind of foundation for how we come to some of these questions. So another question is how, this is from Washington, D.C., and it was submitted on December 24th, and how the party survived the counterinsurgency, part 3. How do we keep our young people from being recruited into the imperialist war machine? It is a policy that middle and high school children, girls and boys from black and brown communities be targeted. And the only way to take that on effectively is through organization. And through organization that recognizes that, why wouldn't you want the children to be recruited into the war machine? Because you don't believe in it. Because hopefully you come to conclude that the war machine is an instrument through locking oppressed peoples into our station of oppression at the service of a social system that sucks our blood and our resources. That's the question. It not only requires organization, but it requires organization and support of a revolutionary organization, African People's Socialist Party being such an example. But there are others, you know, in the other colonized communities. And that's what it's going to take. We have to go back into our communities and organize on the ground and help the working class come to understand what the hell is happening to us and what the system is, and we have to initiate a process of non-cooperation with the colonizer. We have to win our people to them. Sometimes that's going to mean having mobilization, demonstration at these schools and what have you, going to school board meetings and forcing them to remove the police, to remove the military recruiters and things like that. Much of the South that I'm familiar with, they didn't have police on campuses. They didn't have police on campuses in the African community before desegregation. They like to claim now that the police on the campuses, because people come and shoot up campuses, those are white people. We saw in this country the emergence of the so-called school resource officer, fences around schools and things like that throughout the South. At the moment, there was a so-called desegregation policy where white children were going to be and white teachers were going to be in schools with African children and were perceived as a threat by the colonial administrators of this country. And that's why you had to have the police to maintain a lockdown on the African population. So that's what that was about. That's what. So we have to rebuild revolutionary organization, and we have to remove any delusions from our brain that somehow we're going to find a peaceful way out of this system, that we're going to force or somehow trick or somehow win or somehow seduce the system into treating us well and make fighting and becoming self-determinant, self-governing unnecessary. That's not going to be the case. So we have a question regarding the colonialists. This is from Adam Eternal from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. The Netherlands, that's where they sent out the first ship that's recognized of captive African captives, Holland, to the United States. I've heard that it was called a good ship Jesus. And if that were the case, it was probably blessed by the saint of shipping. And the saint of shipping was that Santa Claus? Santa Claus. In other words, you call him here Santa Claus. Santa Claus, right? What a great gift, a wonderful gift from Holland. So the question is regarding and then we could talk about that too, because you talk about counterinsurgency, and look at Holland itself, where every year, beginning in part of November and through December, there is this celebration of where Santa Claus comes into Amsterdam on a ship. He rides a white horse dressed like the Pope, and he has this servant with him whose name is Zwarte Piet, or Black Pete. And Black Pete wears pantaloons and stuff like that, reminiscent of the Moors. And because so Black Pete has a stick, and he travels with Santa Claus, and they go to bring goodies for the good children, and Santa Claus hits the bad children with a stick and put them in a sack, and he takes them to Spain. And he takes them to Spain because you may know that at one time Holland was colonized by Spain. And Spain, of course, the Moors, African people, the Moors, were dominant forces in Spain, which is why Santa Claus was black. Well, you have a Zwarte Piet, and which is why you have throughout Holland during this period of time, you have all these white people who put on blackface. Little children put on blackface. I was in Holland, in Amsterdam, one of these periods, and I was in a shop to purchase something, and I saw these black children had what looked like soot on their faces, and I wondered why these children had dirty faces. Literally, that's what I'm thinking. And not recognizing that I had walked into this whole Santa Claus celebration thing, and you had all these white people who had a little more than soot, had black stuff on their faces. Some of them had on fake afros and dreadlocks and what have you, and they were there, and they have this whole celebration. And all the white people, they swear it's got nothing to do with slavery, and that Santa Claus and Black Pete became black because he slides down the chimney, and it's the soot on the chimney that made him black. And I guess that's why he got the whole makeover. So he started down the chimney white, and then on the way down, he developed afros and dreadlocks and black skin. That's the lie that they tell. So you got everybody practicing this. You got African children who are humiliated on a regular basis there. I think we're doing an interview that I did with a woman some years ago. And we play that on Black Power 96 today on the story of Christmas and what have you. But what an amazing kind of counterinsurgency that's used to maintain the domination and create a caricature of this relationship existing between white power and African people, and the whole process of developing capitalism itself. So, but anyway, this is from Rotterdam. And there's a thing called a cold case Hammarskjöld. I don't know if I pronounced this absolutely correctly, but there's a guy named Dag Hammarskjöld who at one time was with the United Nations, and he was killed by the CIA. That's who killed him. I mean, there's some element of questions of how he died and what have you. So the question here is that in South Africa, there's a Danish investigative journalist, Mads Brugger, established that in South Africa in the 80s, a racist, quote unquote, white supremacist organization with ties to U.S. and British Secret Services tried to use HIV/AIDS as a weapon against blacks in South Africa and other African countries by infecting black populations with HIV/AIDS virus. Do you believe that this is part of the counterinsurgency? It's definitely part of the counter, and it definitely happened. This is no suspicion. It is real. We've had testimony at the so-called, this farce that the ANC, South African government created, Truth and Reconciliation. I mean, there's this guy who presided over this process where they come into a colonized African community with the pretensions, since you don't have any health care, we bring in health care to you, and they set up this so-called clinics and what have you to infect African people with AIDS, HIV. They did it in South Africa, they did it in Zimbabwe, they did it in other places like that. And it's not even an outlandish thing. I mean, here's a book called Poisoner in Chief. And it's a book written by a guy named Stephen Kinzer. It just came out. And it's about Sidney Gottlieb. And they say the CIA searched for mind control. I don't know if it was searching for mind control or not, but it did some horrible stuff that's consistent with how the America has worked for the longest period of time. So here's a passage from that. It said, besides working in their laboratories at Camp Detrick, that's Fort Detrick today in that DMV area, Washington, D.C., Virginia, Maryland area. Scientists assigned to what they had a program called MK, they really had a program called MK Ultra. This was the CIA. Most people, and we talk in the book that I just quoted from, we talked about the counterinsurgency, FBI, COINTELPRO, but what doesn't get discussed is the role that the CIA was playing in that, because the CIA mandate did not allow it to be able to carry out actions inside the United States against quote-unquote United States citizens, but it was there all the time. That's one of the reasons COINTELPRO has been so pronounced and put forward, because it helps to liquidate or disguise or undermine or obscure the role that was being played by the CIA, which was horrendous. And so it says, besides working in the laboratories at Camp Detrick, scientists assigned to MK Naomi, this was another iteration of what came to be known as MK Ultra, carried out field tests to learn how biological agents might work in crowded environments. Some observed bioweapons tests conducted by the British military, including one near the Caribbean island of Antigua in 1949, during which hundreds of animals died. This is in 1949. They did this in Antigua. And this is an island of black people, you know, and so they say hundreds of animals died. That same year, 6 members of the Special Operations Division entered the Pentagon pretending to be air quality monitors and sprayed mock bacteria into air ducts. Afterwards, they calculated that if their attack had been real, at least half of those working in the building would have died. Since some of the scientists were researching biowarfare, how to wage it, and how to defend against it, they wanted to learn how pathogens could be spread in a concentrated population and what the effects of such an attack would be. In 1950, they decided to carry out a large-scale outdoor test in which harmless but traceable germs could be released into the air of a large American city. They chose San Francisco not only because it has a coastline and tall buildings, but also because its chronic fog would disguise germ clouds. The U.S. Navy supplied a minesweeper specially equipped with large aerosol hoses. Operation Sea Spray, as it was called, was classified as a military maneuver. Local officials were not notified. For 6 days at the end of September, as their minesweepers drifted near San Francisco, scientists from Camp Detrick directed the spraying of a bacterium called Serratia marcescens into the coastal mist. They had chosen this substance because it had a red tint, making it easy to trace and was not known to cause any ill effects. According to samples taken afterwards at 43 sites, the spraying reached all of San Francisco, all of San Francisco's 800,000 residents, and also affected people in Oakland, Berkeley, Sausalito, and 5 other cities. Over the next couple of weeks, 11 people checked into a hospital with urinary tract infections and were found to have red drops in their urine. One of them, who was recovering from prostate surgery, died. Doctors were mystified. Several of them later published a journal article reporting this curious clinical observation for which they could find no explanation. So I'm not going into all of that, but the point I'm making here, this is a book. It's an interesting book. It's worth looking into. But even what it doesn't begin to scratch the surface, because it doesn't talk about the assault that was made on the Black Revolution that I know happened. I know people who were kidnapped, taken to places in Kentucky, and interrogated by people with these white smocked wearing forces strapped to a table and what have you. I know people who were in that General Camp Dietrich area who I went to school with and came. These were not even people in the movement, because what they were doing, they were capturing people and drugging people and doing things to people without their being aware of it. They had a whole jail situation in Kentucky where that was supposedly treating people with addictions and stuff like that, and they imposed LSD on them in order to engage in mind control. They did it sometimes to their own agents. There was a notorious case where some agent jumped out of a window and killed himself in Manhattan, who was, I think his name was Osborne or something like that, who was an agent who they had drugged without his knowing, because he had begun to have questions about the role that he was playing in this torture and stuff. They brought people, Nazis, who came from Germany. They're supposed to hate Germany, and they're supposed to hate the Nazis and stuff like that. The people who committed experiments on Jews in concentration camps were brought from Germany, had an Operation Paperclip, where they brought them and employed them by the CIA, the U.S. government, and they brought the same thing from Japanese scientists who cut people up open to see what kind of torture they can endure, what it could take to, to maim and harm people, to get them to destroy their will and stuff like that. They put them on the payroll here. So yeah, they did it in South Africa, and the CIA and British intelligence were involved in that. And not only that, there was a case in Cameroon. This may have been in 1987, 86, 87, something like that, where at this lake where thousands of people died and animals died. Mysteriously, no buildings were destroyed, nothing like that happened, and they claimed that some mysterious mist came from the lake and killed these people. And this is at the same time the U.S. government was talking about the creation of a neutron bomb that would destroy people and animals but leave properties and buildings untouched. The U.S. government did that in Cameroon. And then, the stuff that the French did to Africans in Cameroon and other places, I mean, that's why this whole question of counterinsurgency is nothing to play with. And that's why we have to have a scientific approach to revolution. Just because somebody black don't mean they're on the right side, and just because they're militants doesn't mean that they have an understanding of the social system itself. And most of us are responding not to the social system, but we are responding to how it manifests itself in the world, to ordinary views. Without the ability, without a scientific approach to investigation and analyzing, you don't come up with good solutions. That way, because you can come up with a way that you can, all black people are good, all white people are bad, and that can have you loving people like I don't want to go there, what's the guy's name in Haiti that became so notorious, Papa Doc Duvalier, and even the current Haitian government, because they black too, Barack Hussein Obama, and all other traitors, and there are traitors, they're living traitors right now, who participate in counterinsurgency activity. They get the support of the United States government. Jesse Jackson represented the United States government under the Clinton regime. He represented the United States government in Africa. He didn't go there to represent Africa or African people. He went to represent the United States government. He was representing the same social forces that the people who did the HIV testing in South Africa represented. So being black is not enough. You need to have some kind of understanding of the social system. You need to understand some things about how the class question got developed in the African world and articulates itself, and opportunism and how that functions to serve the counterinsurgency. So I'm going to have to move quickly. So there was a question from, by the way, so the South African government, they did have something called a chemical biological warfare thing. They operated some of this out of the Institute for Maritime Research. They were doing the HIV, the Institute of Maritime Research is what they characterize it as. And so we have from comrade from Kuwait. So given the counterinsurgency, all that you've seen, what do you draw upon daily year after year to remain resilient despite the odds and counterinsurgency. So initially, a sense of self-significance, self-importance inspired, like a subjective response to this. I can talk about how my grandmother, when I was growing up, sat me on her knee and taught me certain kinds of things that helped instill in me certain values, et cetera, et cetera. But actually, this is not a personal question. He's not asking a personal question. The question is, how do you? The question is, how can I endure? Knowing what we know about the system and what we have to be subjected to, how can we endure? What can we have to draw upon to allow us to remain resilient? That's not an empty question, because there were people with whom I was involved in this struggle from the 1960s, some of whom became to be well-renowned and iconic. And but they didn't last. They didn't make it. And some just became careerists. That is to say, their career was to be in the movement, but they were not involved in trying to overturn the social system at all. And so what is it then? Some actually retreated. Some capitulated. We saw Eldridge Cleaver, actually capitulate. We saw others who do that. And of course, the class question is fundamental to this too, because many people who came into the struggle, especially during the 60s, where the question became more or less independence from white power, didn't necessarily raise the question of class. And what does independence mean in terms of overturning the social system? What does it mean in terms of what kind of social system you're fighting for? That was one of the things that happened. And so with independence, like we saw this happen in Africa, particularly, not just in Africa generally speaking, but we were working closely with comrades in South Africa, comrades in Zimbabwe. We were, in many instances, their representatives in the United States. But, and they talked Pan-Africanism, quote unquote, by which they meant that the land should belong to African people, by which they stated they meant that all Africans should be united. But as soon as they achieved what they call independence, which means that they could ride to power, which means that they could run and win office and things like that, all that revolutionary stuff disappeared. The revolutionary politics disappeared. The communism disappeared. The socialism disappeared. We saw that. I mentioned Zimbabwe, South Africa, Angola, Mozambique. You said all over the continent of Africa, you saw that kind of stuff happen because the crisis, the reason many people adopted communist and philosophy, or at least articulation, is because all of white power was against the liberation of Africa, all of it. And the exceptions were like the Soviet Union that had its own mission, its own struggle that was going on, and that was contesting with the U.S. and other powers for influence and resources in the continent of Africa. That the Soviet Union that had been isolated economically and could not grow because it did not have access to colonial resources, it supported certain struggles on the continent of Africa. In order to get that support, you became a communist or a socialist. You said you were, and you adopted that kind of language and things like that. But as soon, and you got weapons, you got ideological training, you got support of the United Nations, et cetera, and people did that. But upon the achievement of what they call independence, then you saw that they were merely talking. The Cubans weren't just talking. The Cubans actually sent troops into Angola because they were genuine communists, and they fought and were able to go beyond the limitations that so-called independence was supposed to create for whatever reasons. There are a number of reasons that was the case. So the answer to that, of course, is not some special thing about my upbringing as such. Oh, everybody's upbringing has some influence, but that's not the question. The question is the depth of your philosophical development, the quality of the philosophy, your ideology, what it is that you believe in, your ability to really achieve a historical materialist investigation and analysis, and to build organization around that kind of question. That's the thing that will provide longevity. You're tethered to something bigger than yourself. Because at the moment it's just you, then going to jail, a threat to jail, the threat of getting killed and stuff like that would not allow you to make it. Now, African internationalists are not the only ones who've done that. Materialists are not the only ones. I mean, Malcolm was killed because he had the willingness and he knew they were trying to kill him. Martin Luther King, if you look at the presentation King made the day before he died, he knew he was going to die. And so some people are affirmed and are able to do that kind of stuff because they have a worldview, philosophical, that we would characterize even as idealism. Religion is an expression of idealism. So they were able to do that because they believed in something, but we believe in something too. And the difference is, however, what we believe in is scientifically based. And it promises not some otherworldly consequence, not something that's going to happen as a consequence of somebody being good and somebody being evil, but because we understand the nature of the social system, where it came from, how it came into existence, and what we've come to understand with our philosophy. Our philosophy promises its destruction and promises victory to us, the oppressed. And that's the answer I would give. And then there's a question again from Comrade Eternal from Rotterdam. And he wants to know about the personality, approach, and works of the legacy of Paul Robeson in the struggle for African liberation. And I'm glad you raised Robeson. I mean, Robeson was an extraordinary figure. He was a black person writ large. He was, in terms of international recognition, similar to Muhammad Ali later on in life. He had been an outstanding athlete. He grew up in New Jersey, was born and grew up in New Jersey. I think one of the first few people who graduated from Rutgers. He was a stage actor. He was an opera singer. And he was an activist for freedom and liberation. And he was poisoned by the CIA. This would have been, he was drugged in 1961 at a party in Moscow, probably subject to the same MK Ultra program that we are talking about, where a party that was hosted by anti-Soviet dissidents in Moscow in 1961. And as a consequence of him drinking something there, he slit his wrist. He started having hallucinations and things like that, which is what they were doing. This is exactly what they were doing. Tried to kill himself and never was right anymore. So Robeson was a really important and effective internationalist who really tried to win freedom for peoples of the world. He was not an African internationalist. And he did not even put that much emphasis on being African, but he did certain roles, he made certain movies, he did stuff that would elevate the African personality beyond the images and caricatures that had been created by white power imperialism up to that point. We have somebody who raised, somehow I missed, because there was something about Sankara on here, Thomas Sankara, who was a really important figure, who came to power in what was called Upper Volta, which was controlled by the French, where there had been a series of French engineered coups over a period of time because it was a neo-colonial entity. And something like 1983, Thomas Sankara became the prime minister of a thing they call the Council for the Salvation of the People that had initiated a coup against the existing government, and they chose Sankara as their leader. Sankara became the leader of this, and then he initiated a campaign that renamed the country from Upper Volta, which had no real significance, to something about the country of upright, upstanding people. He initiated really incredibly important programs that took on environmental degradation, took on the poverty and oppression of women, that took on the struggle against imperial extraction of all the resources in the country, had a tremendous unity with the revolutionary movements happening in Cuba and other places. And in fact, he was scheduled to go to a conference held in Cuba in 19, what was that? 1887, when he was assassinated by this guy Campora, who Blaise Campora, that name Blaise is popping up, who was his good friend, and he was part of the National Council of the Revolution that was presided over officially by Sankara. He was murdered, assassinated, and taken out. He was one with the ability to promote the unification of all of Africa, etc., and that's why they had to kill him. Counterinsurgency is what we've been talking about all along. And then the last one that I have, no, I have two more. And so there are a lot of African intellectuals who can spin theory, but when you speak of unity in theory, of unity of theory and practice, can you say more about this, please? This is from Omali Yeshitela. And it is true. You know, we have all these people who talk revolution, talk socialism, talk reparations, etc., but they don't do the practice. And they're brilliant, you know, but the way we know the significance of our theory is through practice. Practice is what helps us to test whatever theoretical views that we have. If you don't do the practice of trying to make the revolution, your theory about revolution can be pretty empty. It has nothing to test it against, no way to measure it, etc. And so we know a lot of people who talk a good game, but who don't do anything to develop revolutionary organization. If you're a revolution, you can't make revolution by yourself. If you're a revolution, one of the absolute necessities for revolution is advanced revolutionary theory and a revolutionary party. If you don't that you're not talking about revolution. So there are people who talk revolution, don't do anything in that direction. There are people who talk socialism. It's so today, with the crisis of imperialism and capitalism capitalism finds ways to cleanse itself, to produce itself in another face to the people in order to preserve itself. So capitalism comes forward as a kind of beneficent, socialism is put forth as a kind of beneficent capitalism. They talk about socialism because they recognize socialism to be a social system that is opposed to capitalism. But most of the people who talk about socialism don't necessarily talk about it in a way that really means it's opposed to capitalism. They always talk about socialism as though it could coexist in the same space as capitalism. It's like something you can wish into existence. But you can't have socialism and capitalism at the same time. You can have a dual power with the objective of negating capitalism so socialism can emerge, which is what we practice. But the fact is that if you have capitalism, if you want socialism, you got to fight capitalism, because capitalism does everything to preserve its existence. That's what the drone strikes, that's what all of the murder, that's what we're talking about with MK Ultra and poisoning people and all this stuff to preserve capitalism. And it is not going to surrender just because you show up and got a good idea and you want to give people $15 an hour over a period of time. No, capitalism is going to have to be fought for, and to fight for it, you got to have organization, you have revolutionary theory, and you got to recognize that capitalism rests upon a foundation of the colonial oppression and exploitation of oppressed peoples around the world, especially of Africa and Africans. So none of them is approaching the question in that fashion. So they think that you can have a good discussion, you can talk about this, about capitalism. You know you're really smart because you've come up with one way. Then there's a sort of pop cultural, pop philosophy, so that you just, all these popular phrases that's now intersectionalism, and you're fighting against, and somehow you're intersectionalizing, or somehow you fighting against toxic masculinity, or somehow you, this, what is that other, there are all these other terms, and it's a popular thing, so you want to pick up feminists now because you say this, and we say down with feminism because it ain't nothing but another petty bourgeois expression that's used to take women, and especially African women, out of a revolutionary project for the liberation of our people that should result in the emancipation of the whole people, because there ain't no way in hell that white feminists could love black people, like black women, without loving black people. You can't be for the liberation of black women without being for the liberation of African people as a whole. And most African women who were brought into political life as a consequence of their relationship to the party and the relationship that African National Women's Organization understand that they're fighting for the total liberation of our people, and the oppression of African women is a consequence of being under colonial domination, and that we have to destroy that colonial domination while fighting to guarantee that African women are going to have their rights and places in the struggle to defeat colonialism and imperialism. So you got all of these things that they bandy about now because it's popular to do this today, because capitalism is facing greater and greater disrepute around the whole world. Nobody consciously wants to be able to say that they are for capitalism, and those who do consciously want to say they're for capitalism have to disguise the fact that they're for capitalism by calling themselves something else. So you can be against paternalism, is that what it is? Patriarchy, and all these other kinds of things, right? And just to liquidate the whole revolutionary question, right? So those are some of the things that we're looking at. Those are what we mean too. We talk about opportunism and how counterinsurgency can intervene. I mean, when the Iranian Revolution happened under the leadership of Khomeini, and I say under the leadership, that's who really seized power, because the people in Iran were fighting against the Shah that was put in place by the United States government in the 1950s. So as soon as the revolution happened, then because it was Islamic expression, you had white feminists from this country literally catching airplanes, they're going over to fight for the liberation of the Iranian women from the revolution. They were not fighting for the liberation of the Iranian women or the Iranian people when the Shah was in power. Now suddenly they become instruments of counterinsurgency. Whatever contradictions and faults you have with the Iranian Revolution, they didn't have nothing to do with it. We saw the same thing happen in Algeria, with French women going down to liberate the Algerian women so they don't have to wear, the hijab and all this other kind of stuff. They didn't give a damn about that as long as France was controlling it. It was now counterinsurgency activity, and this is, again, an expression of opportunism, why the fight against opportunism is fundamental to the struggle for revolution. So I want to say that, and then the question is explain the difference between the state and the government, because they're not necessarily the same. The state is that bureaucracy and organ that controls critical instruments of repression, coercion, the police, the courts, the CIA, FBI, the Homeland Security, the police departments, etc. These are expressions of state power, the state. And in the United States, in places like the United States, there are these elections that happen on a regular basis. And these elections are held so that representative of the imperialist forces themselves, the power, the bourgeoisie, can engage in nonviolent contests for control of the state apparatus. That's what they want, the control of the state apparatus. And over a period of time in the United States, they'd come to a comfortable kind of arrangement. So that the fight for state power happened, in a comfortable way, except at different times, the crisis of imperialism deepens to such extent that it becomes increasingly difficult for the imperialists to have enough loot to go around for everybody to get what they think their share that they should have. It's like the mafia. They end up having to sit down and rearrange stuff. And so you have this contest that happens. And for the last 70 years, this thing that's called the Atlanticist group dominated not only the United States, but all of the imperialist world was dominated by leadership there. This is how capitalism expressed itself. And what we've seen in the United States what we see in the United States is this election happened, but the election happened that the presidential election, and an outsider won the election, which was a fluke. It wasn't supposed to happen. Trump was not supposed to be president of the United States. He did not participate in the way that he was representing any of the other particular capitalist interests in this contest for control of the state apparatus. And so he won. It's a fluke that he won. He had enough money to kick off his own campaign. He had enough name recognition among the whole white population, among the people of the world and inside this country, that he was able to go into the presidency. And but to do that, he had to fight against the system. He literally fought against the system to get elected. So he fought against the wars, he fought against NATO, he fought against the United Nations, he fought against the other candidates who he said represented the bourgeoisie. He said these guys get paid to say what they say, et cetera, and the people were tired, all the people were tired of this setup the way it was, and so people voted for Trump. But because he was not a part of the process, he did not have control of the state. He did not resolve the question of who was going to control the state. That's why every force that he's been fighting, the FBI, the CIA, the intelligence agencies, all of this stuff, he's had to fight against them in this process. He fought people who control the military. He's had people in his administration because he didn't have his own party. He didn't have this same kind of connection with the typical traditional custodians of the state apparatus. So he had to bring in people from who were tied to other sectors of capitalism, and he ends up firing them. They end up exposing him. You have this ongoing contradiction that happens between them. Plus, Trump is now trying to break out of the circle of the Atlanticist and to move toward, with whomever it is, many of the people he's associated with, opening up a new economic front with Russia, so that Russia has certain kind of resources. Russia is hungry for resources, and Trump is moving in that direction. You notice how many people got fired in his administration connected to Russia. How many people in jail now because of the Russian connection, or threatening with jail now because of the Russia connection, and the attack on Trump on an ongoing basis because of the Russia connection, etc. So this is the kind of stuff. So we saw that happen in the go back all the way to the election, if you will, of Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana. He's supposed to be the president of Ghana. He controls the government. Guess who controls the state? The United States controls the state apparatus. The military, etc., that overthrew him was tied to the United States government. You look at what happened in Congo.